long been involved with alpine and rock gardening. And I don't know if this is your most recent project, but one of your really big projects that we can see in public is at the Merritt Lake Gardens. And it's a conglomeration of Hypertuffa troughs, which are planted with interesting plants. And you've been around for decades, but I don't have enough information. So hopefully you can share that with us. But thank you for coming to us.
Hello, everyone. So my name is John Tsutakawa. I'm a rock gardener, alpine gardener from San Francisco. I've been rock gardening about 25 years. And I volunteered at the San Francisco Botanical Garden for about 20 years. They had a volunteer nursery. We were part of the rock garden group, but the nursery propagated plants for fundraising. And then that part of the botanical garden kind of slowed down because they're rebuilding the larger nursery overall. And so for the rock garden group, we moved our plants over to the gardens at Lake Merritt, which is in Oakland. And so that was around 2019, 2020. I organized the demonstration rock garden we have at Lake Merritt. And that includes 12 troughs. And so that's part of the reason I'm talking about the Hypertuffa troughs tonight. My main focus is on alpine container gardens, but I do dabble in a lot of other plants, orchids and natives, and Meconopsis is one of my favorite things. And so I have. Okay, sure. I'll put a little closer. Yeah. Okay. So I dabble in a lot of plants. Meconopsis is one that I really enjoy because I grow those. And that's a picture of some Meconopsis that we had over in a bench over in Oakland, probably 2 years ago. But you can see kind of the color. They come anything from kind of light blues to medium blues. Okay, so one of the largest projects I've done is a rock garden at the gardens of Lake Merritt. So you can see from the picture, it's kind of a ring of 12 trough gardens, of 12 troughs. And each of the troughs kind of represents different styles of gardening. And there'll be pictures throughout the slideshow that show some of these. These troughs, most of them are about 2 foot by 3 foot. There's 3 of them that are 4 foot by 3 foot, so they're fairly large, about 16 inches tall. In the center is a crevice garden, and so that's a style of rock gardening that's becoming very popular now. It's pretty much 95% rock, like four layers of stone piled up on top of each other. So if you were to stand on that mound in the middle, it would support you completely. And for rock gardening, the plants like to grow their roots and run it down to the cracks, just like they would in the mountain or on a cliff. So fortunately, we were able to do the demonstration garden and have a really good position. It's right outside the bonsai gardens. If anyone's actually been to Lake Merritt and seen what we have, but we have a lot of different sort of feature gardens there. So I'll be talking about making Hypertuffa troughs, and just to say although there's a lot of steps, it's fairly easy. I mean, it's basically, you're making kind of a cement kind of thing, you're putting it to shape and letting it harden. But a little padding can make a big difference in how the trough comes out. So I'm going to cover a lot of the smaller details. So I'll talk about trough gardening and Hypertuffa. I'll talk about some of the specific ingredients, and then the process for making the trough, and a little about planting. So I think next month they're talking about, Mark quickly is going to talk about planting succulents in containers. My specialization is planting alpines. So trough gardening originated in kind of the English rock gardening. So, in England, there was a lot of kind of the exploration around the world looking for different species and bringing them back. And so a lot of that was exploration into mountains and bringing back alpine plants. And once they brought them back, the troughs turned out to be a pretty good way of growing them. And I'll talk with some about the advantages of growing things in troughs. In England, there was a lot of stone troughs. that were used for livestock. And, you know, they're carved out of stone, but they're used for watering and feeding animals. And over time, the troughs became less and less because people took them into gardens. And so now it's really hard or expensive to find real stone troughs. So instead of doing stone, around 100 years ago, one of the Alpine Garden Society members came up with a formula for hypertufa. And so the idea of hypertufa was to create something in place of stone. So you didn't have to have a stone trough, you could cast a trough. And so it's named after tufa. And tufa is sort of a natural limestone with a lot of pores and crevices. So that stone on the side, which is a planting, is actually a piece of tufa. So that's a naturally occurring stone. There is a style of gardening called tufa gardening, which is different, where people will drill holes in this type of stone and actually put plants, but they do have to keep that stone damp so the plant doesn't dry out. But this style became a replacement, but it was to look like stone or to look like tufa. And I'm going to pass this around. So this is a piece of hypertufa. So I had extra hypertufa maybe 20 years ago and made a wall out of it. And so you can actually see what it looks like, it feels like. So that's sort of the artificial material that's used for hypertufa. So the advantage of hypertufa troughs is it looks like stone, but it's a lot lighter. One of the things, if you were to make something like, say, out of concrete or stone, it would weigh about 3 or 4 times more than hypertufa. You can make it to whatever size and depth that you want. The hypertufa does absorb water and it has good aeration. In any type of container gardening, you control whatever soil you're going to put in there, what mixture, how much drainage, and so that's great for alpines, but also for succulents and other plants. For alpines, it's important to eliminate competition from other plants. The alpines grow above the tree line, and they're very exposed, but it also means they get full sun. And so they don't do well kind of in competition with plants that are going to shade them out. So a trough is something where you can control what's going in there, and you can also manage weeds and stuff. In the same way, the trough brings the plants closer to eye level. So particularly for children, because they can look closer to the plant because they're raised a foot or 2 feet above the ground, and it's relatively inexpensive. So the basic recipe for hypertufa. So what is hypertufa? Hypertufa is a combination of Portland cement, of perlite, and peat moss. And nowadays, people are substituting peat moss with coconut coir. And the reason why is because peat moss is becoming more of a limited resource. And you know, there's a lot of ground of coconut coir, so you need to use that instead, and then water. One ratio that people use is 1:1:1. So in terms of volume, 1 part cement, 1 part perlite, 1 part peat moss or coconut. But there's a lot of different variations that people have. Another ingredient that I included was reinforcement fibers or fiber mesh. I'll be talking in a little bit about reinforcement fibers. So you can change the formula. Like there's a common book. There's a book out now right now on doing trough gardening that they have a 1 part cement to 1.5 parts perlite to 1.5 parts peat. And so the first formula cell was about 33% cement, and another might be like 25%. So what hypertufa is, it's really a perlite concrete. So normal concrete is cement, Portland cement, it's sand and it's gravel. And there's little variations of that, but that's your basic ingredients to make the concrete for buildings, highways, whatever. Hypertufa is a similar thing. It's a concrete that is made out of cement, perlite, and peat. So it's kind of a weaker concrete. But it is, and so just like any type of concrete, you can change the amount of cement in there, to make it stronger or lighter. The more cement you put in the formula, the heavier it's going to be, but the stronger it's going to be. Also having peat moss or coconut also weakens the mix a little, but it gives it kind of a softer texture. So when you're looking at making hypertufa troughs, the first question, what do you want to make? This is actually a picture from a friend of mine, his backyard. He passed away a few years ago, but he would crank out troughs all the time. So you can see he had piles of troughs in his backyard. They would suck. But the first thing you want to do is figure out, like, what do you want to make? So I'm guessing by having me as a speaker, there's probably some interest in making hypertufa troughs. So your first question is, what shape? You want it kind of like a rectangle, a box, you want it round, you want it kind of in a regular shape, how big do you want to make it? And it's usually good to start simple. But as you get more practice, my friend who passed away, Mr. Kubota, he liked to do a lot of rounds. And so as you can see, a lot of the stuff were like bowls, where a lot of the stuff I did were more like boxes. Okay, so once you've decided what you want, then you kind of go through these steps of how to make a trough. So you know what you want, so you do sort of design, and I'll go into detail. So you make it, you design how you're going to do it. You create a checklist because you're dealing with concrete. Once you start mixing with that, then you're kind of on a limited timeline of getting that into shape and putting it in the mold as a hardens. Then you're gonna make the mold itself, and that can be different forms. You'll gather the materials and choose together. And once everything is ready, then you're gonna mix the concrete. You're gonna pour it and tamp it into the mold. And then you'll let it sit for a couple of days and then remove it out of there. And then you're gonna cure it, bleach, and let it, and then finish it. So in terms of the design, it's always good to kind of sketch it out. I was trying to find a sketch I had for the troughs I was making. I couldn't find any, so I just sketched this out to have an example. But the idea here looking at it was, some of these troughs I made were 36 inches long, 24 inches wide. They're about 12 to 14 inches high, and then they had 3-inch walls. And so you want to have your mold so you can make something like this. If you have a double-sided mold, it's a lot easier to control the wall thickness. If you only have the external or the internal mold and you're building around it, it's your final product is going to tend to have a lot thicker walls. So you figure out like what kind of mold you're going to create, what the dimensions are. You think about reinforcement, and that reinforcement is important. And I'll talk about that. You want to put it in drainage holes. You got to figure out how you're going to do that, and then what type of finishing touches you want. So this is sort of a materials checklist, just to show you kind of the things. You have your basic ingredients, your cement, your perlite, your peat or coconut, reinforcement fibers, water, and then you get into stuff that you need for your molds. It could be plastic container, it could be wood frame, wood screws with brackets. What are you going to use for drainage, which could be like PVC or clay pots or different things. Then you look at what reinforcement, and then your tools. So your mixing tub, your hose, your hoe or scoop for mixing, the spatula, other types of things. So we'll go to the basic materials. So as I said, there's like your 3 main ingredients and then reinforcement fibers. So your Portland cement, it's usually a type 2 to 4 type of cement. I think they go from 1 through 6. It probably doesn't matter as much what you want. It's just, but what you want is Portland cement. You don't want concrete. So you'll see these bags. This was I think at Home Depot. And it's 47 pounds. It's nice because they used to all be like 94 pounds. And so these are a little easier to drag around. But this cement is just that fine gray dust. And so it doesn't have gravel, it doesn't have sand. because you want to control what's going to go into your concrete. Most people use perlite because of the weight. And so what perlite is you'll probably know, it's expanded volcanic glass. It's popped up like popcorn. Then perlite is very light. Size 1 to 2 perlite is good. If you use size 3 to 4, so people are familiar with the different sizes perlite comes in the bags. There are much larger chunks of perlite. Size 3 to 4 are generally larger, but probably too larger for mixed cases. And then perlite is white, which I know a lot of gardeners don't like because of the color. But when you use it in hypertufa, the gray from the cement kind of covers up that white. So unless it gets broken or exposed, you don't really see it stand out so much. But you can use other materials instead of perlite, like you can use pumice or sand or gravel. It just could be a lot heavier for the end product. Another ingredient is peat moss or coconut coir. And so traditionally people have used peat moss, and it was a lot more available. And now that people are looking at that as a limited resource, what you can use is coconut instead. And coconut usually comes in blocks, compressed blocks, so that you can get some of it which are loosened up. But you would basically take it out, you have to moisten it, and then break it into crumbs so that you can mix it in. You don't really want the chunky or the large pieces of coconut. So what I consider like the fourth ingredient, so you have cement, you have perlite, and then you have coconut. The fourth thing I look is for reinforcement. And so the thing about concrete is that it has very strong what they call compressive strength. And so that means that if you're standing on it, or if you put a car on it or a building on it, when the weight comes down, it's very strong. Where concrete is not so much the tensile strength, where if there is kind of like a force that shears it from the side and it breaks. And what concrete tends to do is that it has a lot of little cracks, and the cracks join together and become a larger crack. And so if you look at the picture, this is actually from a trough I did 20 years ago, and I didn't have reinforcement fibers in there. And so it would form a crack, and over time, the little cracks kind of form into a big one. And so this year I was moving this thing around. The big side fell out of it, and I could see it happening. I could see it happening over like a 5 or 6 year period where it had a crack that got bigger and bigger and became more of a gap. And I thought it was strong enough I could still move it around, but it's snapped. But you can see kind of here where the large crack was formed. So the reinforcement prevents development of cracks. So when people talk about reinforcement of concrete, it's like rebar that people use like in cast and guard concrete buildings. Chicken wire is a type of reinforcement for stucco. Straw and adobe. I think even like horsehair they used to use a type of reinforcement fiber. So there's two main types of reinforcement. There's fibers and metal meshes. Okay, so fiber reinforcement. I'll pass this bag around. So this is actually fiberglass, and so there are a lot of different types of fibers that can be mixed in. And what these do is like when you see the previous slide where you see the large crack forming, is that it prevents the crack from spreading out or even starting in the first place. And so it's kind of this internal reinforcement within the concrete that prevents that splitting or cracking. So there's a lot of different types you can do. This is fiberglass. And if you use fiberglass, of course, you have to use gloves because you don't want it in your skin or fingers. But there's different types of plastics. There's expanded basalt. There's coconut fiber. There's different stuff you can use. I kind of like the fiberglass the best. And when you use fiberglass, people are a little worried that it's gonna show up, and it's not really that noticeable. But if you do see it and it bothers you, you can also take like a blowtorch, melt it away, so it doesn't show out on the static. But you don't really see it. It's easy to buy online. That's like that package I'm sitting around. That's probably like a lifetime supply for somebody. It's like $15 or something. So you could if people are doing it, you could buy one a pack and split it on a bunch of people. The thing with the fiberglass and some of these others is that they tend to clump. And so when you mix it in, you have to separate them out as much as possible. Otherwise, you end up with kind of a clump of fibers in your hypertufa mix. So usually you just want to get in there, get the mix, and start pulling it apart until it's as loose as you can. The other type, so you have your fiber reinforcement, you have your wire reinforcement. And so wire is more like the rebar. And it's sort of a hard internal reinforcement. And you use it kind of on the sides and the bottoms of large troughs. You really wouldn't use this kind of a hard wire on a small trough. You could probably just use fiber. On a large trough, you use both. And so the example in the middle picture is, I think 1/4 inch hardware cloth, and then there's 1 inch by 2 inch wire mesh. And they also have like 1 inch by 1 inch, then 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. But those will support. So those troughs, those 2 foot by 3 foot troughs and 3 foot by 4 foot troughs that we build are actually really strong because they have layers. And so you can actually see on the left, it almost looks like a bed spring kind of thing. That's actually reinforcement that went into the bottom of one of the large troughs. And then it had stuff going up the sides. But that actually has probably 2 or 3 layers of reinforcement that gets sunk into the cement. Okay, so then those are your main ingredients and talking about reinforcement. Then you get into molds. So there's a lot of different things you can use for molds. What I use the most are wooden frames. And so this is kind of a box and box kind of mold. So you have on the right side, you can see outer boxes. And on the left, it actually has a wireframe over it already that matches both boxes. So that left box actually fits in that's an internal box that fits in the external box. And so the cement's going to go between those. And the way I set it up is that those troughs are actually sitting on 4 foot by 4 foot plywood with plastic. And so it's not an attached bottom, but I'm going to build the trough right on top of that plywood with the plastic. Then I'll put the outer frame, I'll lower, put the cement in there, then I'll put the inner frame in there and pour cement into the sides. But you can use a lot of different molds. When I first started, I used a lot of plastic office bins. And so I find ones that were really smooth, nice shape and size, nice depth. And then use that as kind of this mold. And that was more of what would be an external mold. And on the inside, I had to put like bags of sand or perlite or other kind of things to try to hold in so that the cement doesn't collapse into the inside. Tended to make really thick on the bottom in terms of the walls. That's why I prefer this, where it's kind of you have an external frame and an internal frame. A lot of people also do like kind of free shaping. So what my friend was doing was he would either out of sand or I think using bowls, he would use that as sort of an internal mold and put it upside down, and then he would build kind of a bowl-shaped trough around on the outside of it. And that was more his style of doing that. And so there are ways if you want to go for different. I made a couple large round troughs and basically built it in giant containers using external. Some of the things you'll read about is people will talk about using styrofoam boxes like fish boxes, and they'll cover it with cement or hypertufa. And so it'll look like it's a hypertufa box, but it's really kind of a hypertufa covered styrofoam box. The problem with that is that 10 years, 15 years down the road, it'll probably chip, and then you'll see the styrofoam. So it'll look good for a few years, and it'll slowly break down. I remember doing one with a milk crate. I do a lot of experimentation. I remember doing a milk crate, and I used that as my internal frame, and I just put hypertufa on the inside and the outside of it. And it looked good until the corner chipped off and you see the plastic milk crates. Some people use cardboard and bricks. And so they'll take a box and like a cardboard box and so you have inside outside. But the only problem with the cardboard is they tend to get soggy and sag. And so it is one way people do it, but I think if you're using plywood or wood, you end up with a much stronger frame. So I talked about like different wood forms. So here you can see kind of the box to box. This is plywood, uses brackets to hold the corners. So you can make it to an exact size. So the idea of this one was, I'm pretty sure this is 4 foot by 3 foot. And the idea was to have a 3-inch wall. And so with a box in the box, you control the size of the wall by just measuring carefully. The other thing that's good about these type of wood frames is that concrete shrinks as it dries. And so sometimes it's hard to get an inner mold out if you wait too long and you try to get it out. So a wood frame like this, it's actually set up so that you can unscrew it and you could fold it in on itself. So you collapse the inside mold pretty easily. So you do the top side, the bottom side, and then you do the left side and the right side. And you're able to get it out of there pretty easy. The other advantage of these type of wood frames is it's easy to tamp down and eliminate any air pockets. And where you're going to get air pockets is particularly if you have metal reinforcement in there and trying to work the cement around the metal reinforcement. But the way you do is you take a rubber mallet, hit the side, it'll kind of slide down and collapse, and hopefully fill those air pockets. As I said, you can also do plastic bin tubs. I used to look for the ones that were kind of the office letter size file storage boxes. But this is an example of, that's actually one of those big plastic, black plastic animal trough. So it's really a nice size. I'm trying to think how many gallons that might be. It might be like 56 gallons. So in this one, you know, you can see where the cement is pressed around. So it's just basically a external mold. And then I probably put perlite or something on the inside. Then I flipped it out. So what you see on the right is the trough once it was kind of dumped out of there. And then there were some air pockets in there that I was like filling. Can't really see that. And then I'm not sure if this, I made 2 of them. And so what you see on the bottom is one of the troughs that came out of this mold. Okay, so you want to build your mold, get that set up, then you want to build your wire frame. If you're gonna do it in a box style, then you want to try to get that frame so it fits exactly in the middle of the gap, so that you can have cement on both sides. If you're going to run up the sides, continuous is better or overlapping is better. Because if there is like if the trough gets lifted or moved, it's going to get that shearing pressure that may cause it to break off. And so if you have the wire frame continuous or overlapping, that'll prevent it from snapping or breaking at that point. You can also cut out patches and then bend them like L brackets and put those in corners to help support those corners. You want to set up your drainage holes. So in this one, I just took a PVC pipe and then cut them in like 2-inch, 3-inch pieces. And then I just stick it in wherever I want to have them. Like these, I think I was doing four for a trough. Ended up just leaving them in there. But I could have pulled them out. In the past, I've used things like if I have small broken clay terracotta pots, you know, like 2-inch pots or something like that. I'll stick that in there in the same way, and I'll just take a hammer and smash them out when I'm done. But you can use a lot of different things to do that, but you do want to have that drainage. You can drill holes. if you forget to do this, or if you prefer doing that. But you have to make sure you do it carefully so you don't actually crack the hypertufa. Okay, so you have your mold, you have your reinforcement, you have everything ready. And so then you're ready to start. You're gonna mix the cement. So just like cooking, you want to have everything for your recipe in place. You do want to use gloves to protect your hands from the cement, but particularly if you're using fiberglass fiber reinforcement, you want to have gloves to protect from that. You want to keep your ingredients dry before mixing. And down below, I mentioned that being aware that moistened peat and foyer, the coconut foyer, are damp. And so I remember pre-mixing something the night before because I thought it would save me time. But the dampness from the coconut interacted with the cement overnight before I actually mixed it. So it's better just to wait till right before. So you get your ingredients, you pre-mix your dry ingredients before you add the water, because you don't want to be trying to incorporate the coconut with cement with perlite while you're adding the water itself. It's a lot easier to get it even mixed dry. Usually you're going to use a concrete mixing tub, and what I found is that using a hoe, like a garden hoe, is actually good for mixing. I've used shovels and stuff, but it's hard to get kind of a good mix of that. Okay, so you have your dry mix, everything's ready. You can throw in your fiber reinforcement in there. So the next step is adding the water. This is kind of a critical step. What you'll realize is that if you add too much water, it'll weaken the concrete. On the other side of it, if it's too dry, it'll weaken the concrete. And so I know when I first started making hypertufa, I was so worried about putting too much water in there, then I would make it a little on the dry side. So the way to tell kind of the difference, you won't see a lot of formulas that tell you how much water to put in there. It's kind of like making a batter. And it's going to depend on how damp stuff is. But the stuff you have in the mix, the concrete. So you're gonna pour the water in, and what you're trying to do is to get a certain consistency. And what I found is that it's just glistening, so it's all wet, and you have that kind of the shiny glisten look. That's just not enough. What you want in a concrete mix is for it to be that gray, milky, slurry kind of a mix. And what that is that's the particles of cement in suspension in the solution. And so you want to have as much of the particles in there as possible. So the way you're going to get that is to have the right amount of water and also to mix it really well. For some people that are doing large quantities, they can use those concrete mixers, those tubs that kind of turn around if they want to make a huge quantity. But most people are actually, hand mixing this in a mix. You don't want to run your water. You don't want to put it too much where it spills or pours out or runs. And if you put too much water in there, you can add more dry mix. If it's too dry, you can add water. So you can keep adjusting to get to the right consistency. But I think the key is to look for kind of that gray, milky, not runny, but that slurry that's in the mix. So now you mix it up, it's wet, it's ready to go, and you're pouring and scooping. So you can use different things like a shovel or other kinds of stuff. I like these type of scoops. It's actually got some stuff to it. But this is like those bins, storage bins they use with grain and other kinds of stuff. It's sort of a hardware store scoop. It actually works really well for scooping out the cement and dumping it into your frame. You want to cast when you're pouring it. You want to cast in place because most of the time, unless it's really small, you're not going to be able to move that trough for a couple days. So, and it'll be heavy. So if you can cast it where you're eventually going to put that trough, that's also, but that's not totally necessary. You start with the bottom first, and so with some molds, you're going to like where I have kind of a loose bottom. I'm going to do the mold. I'm going to do the bottom layer first before I drop the internal mold, internal frame. While you're doing the bottom, you're going to put in your drainage holes. So if you're using PVC, put them where they're going to go. And then as you're putting the cement, work the cement around those holes. So you don't want to fill them up. But if you do get a little bit of cement in those holes, or if it's a little watery, it's there, that's okay, because you can break that out. So scoop it in to the mold, or if you're using an external mold only, you're going to press it up against the side. So if you're using a plastic mold or plastic bin, you're going to press that up against the side of the mold, and then you'll put something inside to support it. You want to avoid creating air pockets, but those will happen. If you have a wire reinforcement, you're careful to work the mixture on both sides, so the inside and the outside of the wire reinforcement. As you get to the end of it, you want to make your outer top rim as even as you can, as level as you can, because if it's lumpy or it has big gaps, it's something you're going to have to fix later. So the better it is at the end of this step, the easier it's going to be. So you pour it in there, you're gonna tamp as you go. I use a lot of sticks to eliminate the air pockets. So one thing that's useful is like a 1 or 2 inch board, maybe about 12 inches long, or a 2x4 that's maybe 8 inches long. And I'm using the ends of these because they're flat to match the cement down. And the 1x2 or smaller ones are easy to kind of push through and try to find air pockets. If you have a wooden frame, as I said earlier, just take a wooden rubber mallet and you just tap on the wooden frame. And each time you tap, that cement's going to sink. It's going to settle a little bit. You don't want to overdo it because the concrete is still a liquid, even though it's very thick and heavy. And each time you do it, you're going to put pressure on the bottom. You can actually blow out your frame, but just tap to get rid of the air pockets. Okay, so here is an example of like the box on the box. You can see the cement on the bottom. You can see the walls are on the inside between the two frames. And then you're just going to leave it. I leave it for 2 or 3 days because I know it's at that point it's strong enough. I can take the frames out. So I'm going to take the inside frame out. I'm going to take the outside frame away, and then just expose it. If you do it too soon, it might be weak and just break. If you wait too long, it's going to shrink, and it'll make it a little harder to get that internal frame out because the cement's actually pushing in on it. So once you remove that frame, you just let it sit there and dry and cure for a couple weeks. And so a lot of people will cover it with like a plastic tarp so that you have some humidity, it doesn't dry too fast. And they'll spray it with water it won't just dry out and crack. So these are some of the larger troughs we did in Lake Erie, and you can see kind of like what I was talking about, like top edge is a little lumpy. And so we had to actually take files, even those out. And that's kind of the fixing of it. The better it is in your casting, the easier it be when you're at this stage. But there's two things: there's drying and there's curing. So the drying of the trough is the water evaporating or dehydrating out of that cement. And that's one step. But the curing is the chemical process. And so the curing of what's happening with the cement and the other ingredients, it's a chemical reaction, and it's bonding and strengthening. And so it can continue to strengthen over many months. And so that's why it's not so bad. Like if you took a hose and sprayed this, it's not just going to wash it away. It'll just continue to cure, and whatever water you spray on there is dry off. And so at this point, you're more focused on curing. So as I say, it's okay to spray with water. and to leave in the rain, because that's not going to do much. It'll just slowly just sit there and cure. So fresh concrete is highly alkaline. So if you use it to plant plants in right away, plants that don't like alkaline are not going to do so well. The base will be removed over time. It'll sort of like naturally leach out. But what they used to do is that people would make these and they leave it out over winter, and let the winter rain kind of because it's slightly acidic, kind of wash away and leach it. So you can kind of accelerate that by just like for these, we were just hosing them down. So I would come in once a week and just hose it down. And I think I made like a wheat vinegar solution, sprayed it on there. And so I was just trying to accelerate moving it away from kind of that alkaline state to more neutral. And so usually you're able to use this after a few months. So you're letting it cure, you're leaching it, but you're also putting finishing touches on it. And so after the first couple of days, the concrete is still a little soft, but you can start working on it. And so things you can do is you can take a wire brush and smooth the sides if they're lumpy or they have sort of shape. You can sand and round out the corners with a file. So the large troughs, I actually found like a horse load trough that they use for taking their horses. It's actually a very good thing for working on large troughs, trying to smooth out the edges, corners, so they have more of a natural look. Another thing is that you can create cracks. So the top is a hypertufa trough I did about 20 years ago, and I think I either took a nail or something sharp, and I just ran lines in there, and I would just kind of dig it deeper and deeper along that same line. And so what I'm trying to do is create the look of kind of a natural stone, of a layered stone, and it's fairly easy to do. Another thing you can do is that you can encourage moss growth. So this is my friend Mr. Devotis, his style, and you can see how he has kind of cracks. He sometimes use plastic and stuff when you wrap it that created kind of a texture to it. But this is actually his moss that's growing in his straw from years ago. And then if you have any air pockets, naturally you'll fill them at this time. So that's the making of the trough. Made it, cast it, letting it dry and cure, and then after that it's ready to plant. So there's a lot of things you can do with troughs. So I focus on rock gardening and alpines. You can grow succulents in these. This is an example, kind of a miniature landscape style, where that's actually a flagstone in the back to look like mountains and then little trees. You can take a crevice garden and put a crevice garden into a trough. We have one of those. Use miniature trees, native plants. So in the planting of the trough, you ideally want to plant in place because of the weight. So these trough like this. So this is actually one trough, 3 foot by 4 foot. It probably weighs about 250 to 275 pounds. So when you put plants and rocks in it, it might weigh 500, 600. And so you want to plant it in place. Although smaller troughs, you could actually pick them up and carry them on, even though they're planted. You want to plant stuff for the long term, so like your soil mixes and stuff. Troughs can actually last for years, and the plants will grow together. So you want a soil that's not just going to burn out or become really waterlogged. Consider watering needs. If you're going to install drip irrigation. You think about how plants are going to grow together or grow in size over time, and you have to be willing to edit it. And so I use this as an example because this is all the same trough. So the original upper left corner was the idea of creating like a Japanese island garden. So that's actually white stone on the outside, and then stones, and you can see how it kind of filled in. And it uses New Zealand Rauolia and alpine to look like moss. But for some reason, this wouldn't work. And I think part of the reason it could have been because I made it so it can hold water more. But I don't know if it'd be that. It could have been the particular rocks I was using. But I think it may have been that the kids in this public garden will take handfuls of the gravel and throw it on top and just cover up the plants. And so the edges would start dying and it wouldn't look very good. So eventually I said, okay, forget that. And so I changed it to the bottom left corner and using a different design. So that's a 300-pound rock that we dumped in the middle. And there's probably about 40 or 50 little plants that are in that planting. And then you can see a few, like probably 5 or 6 months later, how those plants have filled in. So it's just a solid mass of different alpines that have grown together in the mosaic. But yeah, the trough gardening, like any kind of thing, if it doesn't work for your conditions, or particular conditions where you have it, or the types of plants you're using, always think about like you can change it, you can make it different and better. So someone was mentioning subdividers. I threw this picture in there. It's one of the miniatures. So there are different soil mixes to use. You can use a rich alpine mix, which might be like 60% organic, going all the way to like 40% organic, where 60% of it's inorganic. I had a friend who really liked to grow lean mixes, and he would use almost like a 90% humus and then 10% organic. He was a nurseryman in Washington State. You can also do succulent mixes, 50-50. I always think of mixes in terms of organic or inorganic, but you can use whatever mix you want. In most troughs, you can go a little bit richer than you normally would, because the trough itself is going to absorb a little water. You'll have large air holes on the bottom, so you have good aeration. So whatever, like if you're interested in container gardening, whatever you know about container gardening, you can apply to troughs. It's basically just a shape, a different type of container. But the little differences are, remember that fresh concrete is highly alkaline, you should treat it. The hypertufa absorbs some water because it has either coconut or peat in there. The trough should have good aeration. If it's high drainage, you need to take that into consideration for watering. And the hypertufa is a little bit weaker. And so, or you might be able to carry around and move around the heavy clay pot a lot. Hypertufa, you could set up a trough and let it sit there for 20 years. But if you keep moving it around, it's not a strong concrete and it might break it. So any questions? I put more pictures of there, right? But those are blue gentians on the left.
What would be the inorganic in your mix?
So for alpine gardening, I'll use perlite, humus. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So she's asking what would be inorganic versus organic. So I mainly do rock gardening and alpine gardening. And so for inorganic, I'm thinking pumice, perlite, gravel, maybe red lava, but each of them have different properties in terms of aeration, of being able to hold water, having how porous they are. So I usually use mixes. And then organic, I'm going to be using soil, compost. I might use, if I want something that lasts longer, I'll use bark. I used to use really coarse peat moss when they used to have that available, but now I hardly ever use peat moss at all. I don't use sand, but I think succulent growers will use a lot of sand. For alpine growers, you don't get as good aeration because the sand tends to fill in the air gaps. Yeah. So I do. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, just keep reminding me. So the question is treating the sides of the molds with oil or something. So I have experimented with so the idea is that you would put oil on the outside of a container, so that it's easier to remove the finished product when you're done. The cement can stick. I have experimented with that. What I found is like some stuff like the plywood, it helps, and you're able to control it. It's a little trickier when using like a one-sided mold, like an external mold, because you don't want to push that cement there, and as you're going, it slides down. But you do have to think about that of like, is it really going to stick? That's probably why I try to move while it's, after 2 or 3 days rather than after it really sets, dries. But you can do that. You can put like oil or some type of thing to make it a little bit easier to move. Yeah.
And if the residuals or if the part handle the container afterwards,
So I've never noticed it. Oh, sorry, I'll repeat it. So the question is about the fiberglass reinforcement fibers. When it's dry, is it sticking out? Does it poke you? That kind of stuff. And so where I've seen it used, where I've used it, I actually don't see it out. So I've always known that I can take a blowtorch and melt whatever sticks out and it looks funny. But I've never had that. And I think what happens is that when you're making cement, it kind of gets pressed in. So it's not really sticking out, it's kind of stuck on the side. So it's not there. I haven't had anything where I'm lifting the trough and like getting poked by it. But yeah, I suppose you could. In the mixing and the handling of it itself, I definitely would use gloves. So that you don't get little pieces of the fiberglass. It's pretty easy to use, but like I said, I think I explained, it tends to clump. And you don't want sort of clumps of fiber in the mix. You want to break it up as much as possible. And that's kind of a tedious step. You do have to loosen up those clumps. I'll just make hands with gloves on. It doesn't require a lot. It's just kind of like maybe put a cup in there or something, or a cup and a half. So as you can see, there's a lot of that back. And so that would be more than enough for me to do like those 12 troughs. And so if you're doing kind of like making it at home and making sort of small troughs and stuff like that, you're just going to use like stuff. And you're going to spread it out as evenly as you can.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused by earlier on, you're saying that we're using coconut before, maybe you should be removing the fibers.
Oh, no.
And I thought I heard you say you made a beat.
No, so when you look at ingredients in terms of, I'm sorry, so he's asking, using coconut, was I saying that with the coconut fibers, make the final product weaker, the hypertufa weaker. And so where it's weaker is that if you look at regular concrete, it's sand, it's gravel. So that gravel and that sand is kind of unbreakable. Cement is in between. So when you're using hypertufa, you're using perlite, which you can crush perlite with your fingernails. It's very weak. Yes. Yes. And so it's actually good to have those little coconut fibers in your coconut coir. The reason why is that they too become real fibers. So one of the tricks I use is I'll use coconut coir, and then I actually take coconut fiber that people use for a floating bath with fire baskets and stuff, and I'll cut it into 1-inch pieces, and I'll throw that in, and so that becomes additional fiber that goes into. I do a lot of experimentation. I mean, like one of the things I used to do is like I would chop up zucchinis and green beans and throw it in there because I wanted little wormholes going through my hypertufa, because that's what tufa. If you look at a piece of tufa, it actually got all those little holes and gaps. So I do try a lot of it. that'd be way too much, you probably would do. I mean, using coconut or peat, gives it kind of a certain softness to the hypertufa. It also makes it so it can absorb a certain moisture and has a certain feel to feel kind of like more of a stone. You would probably see the fibers if you put that much fiber. It might be really strong.
John?
Yeah.
You ever added color? My dad used to get powdered color.
Yeah, so I don't use color, but a lot of friends of mine have used color. So it's that thing of, you know, if you're trying to create something that looks like a stone trough. Oh, I'm sorry, the question is, you use color in concrete. So you can get dyes that you can add cement to get whatever color you want. And so my friend would use like different color dyes to get something to make it a little more reddish. And I've experimented with another friend of using like a black to make it a darker gray. I myself haven't used it, but maybe I'll use like pumice instead of perlite and get a slightly different color out of that. Or throw in red rock to get, you know, red lava to get a certain look. But yeah, that is one thing you can use. I had another friend that didn't do troughs, but he did a lot of rock and cement work. And he would use the color in the mortar to match the stone so it would see this.
So for those who are interested in
You do see them occasionally. So I don't, so like I've seen them years ago at Berkeley Fort. At the Berkeley Fort Nursery. And you see them. So a lot of times it depends on who's making it. Like I don't make large quantities, but you know, 20 years ago, there was these two sisters in Lafayette that just crank them out. Diane Levinson versus. And then my friend in the Sunset District, Mr. Kubota, used his backyard and just covered. And he would crank them out. So if you find someone who's making them, a lot of times whoever has a system down can make them in large quantity. But you will see certain variations of it. Usually to get a perfect product size, everything you want, you have to make it yourself. Okay, sure. So there's the Mechanopsis. So Mechanopsis is sort of side hobby of mine. It's the blue poppies. And that one on the right is one that I look back. So they like cooler weather, they like shade, and they like moisture. And they're used to be wet during the summer. Although they don't really mind the wet winter out. It's not so bad for them. But they're used, a lot of them grow in the Himalayas. They're used to summer months, and so they get rain every day. So they can take the moisture. What you don't want to do, I tend to water on the wet side. I have a friend different friends that grow it, they don't water much ragged. So there was one person in the Richmond Annex, which is that area above near Knoll or Berkeley. He would use a large pot, throw it in the shade, which wasn't heavy shade, and water once a week. Because it didn't have competition. Those in San Francisco, I grow it in full sun. But I think in a hot area, they won't grow it. Yeah, but you want to make sure, like I tried it in Oakland. Like I think I showed a slide with the first slide with a bunch that was going and they were doing well. But I grew it under a bunch of redwoods in the soil, and the redwoods the roots just outcompeted them. And so when it got really hot, the redwoods just stole the water from the soil. So you could grow it in that type of environment, but you don't want to have a lot of root. Problems that I've grown them for a few years. I haven't had problems with slugs. Some it's more when they try out that the seedlings go. They can get a mildew, and then you set it like a copper spray or something to keep that. But the risk is so if anyone grows Maconops seeds, it's pretty easy to get the seeds, a large quantity of them, like order from England or wherever. And you know, buy from a seed company, not from Etsy or eBay, or trying to rip you off. But they're easy to germinate, and you can grow them. It's just a matter of keeping them. They're small, they're tender, and sometimes you grow it and they'll disappear, but they actually gone dormant. I remember the first time I grew them, I thought I killed them. And I do it in the winter of the pot, I saw the little. Oh, so that's another time is that they do go dormant in December and January and just go down to Troughs. And as long as it feels hard and it's not mushy and rotten, but yeah. I don't believe so. But you can always try. I've never heard of anyone growing it indoors. It needs cool, it needs moisture. Indoors might be a little dry. Well, already yes. Because they're used to mountains. So they run the whole range from kind of like lower mountains up to high mountains. So these the one on the right, which is probably a Bailey eye. That's a clump form. Means usually you'll see like 1 or 2 or 3 flowers, but that one form. That grows in shade and kind of scrubby tree areas. There's some that grow in the high mountains totally exposed. But those tend to bloom and die. And then they reproduce these seeds. So it can be, and obviously up in the mountains that high, it's going to be really stunning. Well, usually you want shade, moisture, and coolness. So you wouldn't want it baking in afternoon sun. If you can avoid sun, I would avoid putting on the north side of the house. Although I guess a certain time of the year it's okay. Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Great.